I'd like to first introduce Professor Bruce Kogut. He is the director of the Sanford C. Bernstein and Company Center for Leadership and Ethics at the Business School. He's also a professor of strategy.
Thank you very much. So, good afternoon. So, dear honored guests, Dr. Craig Barrett, the Ambassador Barrett and the Botwinick family, and fellow students and colleagues. Today I have the great honor to introduce to you Dr. Craig Barrett, who is the former CEO and chairman of the Intel Corporation. Dr. Barrett did his education at Stanford University, where he was on the engineering faculty for 10 years before joining Intel in 1974. At that time, and I got this from an interview that Dr. Barrett actually gave out, Intel was earning $50 million a year in sales, and today it's earning $100 million every day. So it's been quite a substantial change over this period of time. The company faced great challenges, as we all know. It has gone up and down in terms of the competition which it's faced, but it's always managed to come back and to be the premier semiconductor company in the world. Now, no matter how great these achievements are, these are not actually the reasons why we invited Dr. Barrett here today. For he is known for being one of the most prominent leaders in the areas of the practice of business ethics. The Botwinick Prize in Business Ethics and Ethical Practice was established with a generous endowment from the late Benjamin Botwinick and his wife, Bessie. And I know there's a few Botwinick students who actually hold scholarships through this endowment. And every year, one of the things we do is to give out the Botwinick Prize, which honors the outstanding leader who exhibits the highest standard of ethical conduct in business and the professions. And we're very fortunate today to have with us the members of the Botwinick family. Now, the person we're going to listen to shortly is someone who comes from, of course, a company we all know very well. Intel is one of the most admired companies in the U.S. and in the world. In fact, I was just talking with Dr. Barrett about that Columbia is often well known for finance, but probably a little bit less for technology compared to Stanford. And what he mentioned to me was that in terms of investment banking, the investment banks are probably the lead customers for the latest computing power, which is sold by Intel every year. It's also known, the company Intel, for a very competitive culture, particularly under the former CEO, Andy Grove, and it's managed to keep its momentum going very much through this ability to constantly renew itself over time. Dr. Barrett is known for a little bit of a different leadership style, a little more team-oriented, and also kind of an engineering, fact-driven leadership style, and the company has succeeded as well under him during his stewardship. During the 1980s, we all know the story. Intel faced tremendous competition, withdrew from memory chips, and was kind of on the ropes. And that time came up with a strategic decision to focus on microprocessors and join the suffix to what became known as the Wintel franchise. This has been a franchise which has had incredible growth and profits over the decades. It's been much criticized by public authorities, but there's also another side to this, and that is its ability to constantly, no matter what was the new competition, to renew itself and to move up to meet these challenges. One of the secrets to this ability to respond has been the very rapid scaling up of manufacturing, and the technique behind this was called exact copy, which is a concept of replicating very quickly what you do best, which Dr. Barrett is quite famous for having created and implemented. Now, what's interesting is that the company did not stay just with this orientation towards the franchise and the profitability, but also has moved out towards trying to use technology throughout the world as an instrument for achieving certain social objectives. The World Ahead program was launched in 2005, addresses the K-12 education. Intel has been active in low-cost computing, particularly in its netbook program, which is driven by a small chip called the Atom. and it also has a dedication to the social responsibility through its programs called Small Things Challenge, which has been a partnership with Kiva and Save the Children. Now, both Dr. Barrett and his wife, Ambassador Barbara Barrett, who I had the honor to meet over lunch, she's a trained astronaut, an entrepreneur, and the former ambassador to Finland. It's a rather unusual CV to have. They both have a very strong commitment to the Thunderberg School of Global Management in Arizona. And Dr. Barrett is signed up to teach a course on ethics at Thunderberg. So in this sense, I'm taking advantage of it to view myself as a colleague to Dr. Barrett and to applaud his commitment to the teaching of ethics, which stand at the core of any organization, including business schools, and the education which they provide. I wanted to say just quickly what we try to do at Columbia, because I know that many of you have heard over the years that ethics is a very fuzzy thing, hard to teach, and that you can't teach people to do right or wrong. It may surprise many people, in fact, that we agree with this, that it's by the time you're adults and come to Columbia Business School, you probably know what right is and know what wrong is. But that's not really what we try to do in our programs. We try to do two things. One of them is to give students the tools they need to identify ethical problems and to resolve them. So we move beyond the debate of right and wrong, but try to give practical tools which you can use in your careers when you face an ethical choice. And you're almost guaranteed to face these choices. The second thing is we try to expand the concept of ethics from just doing right or wrong towards actually doing good. And in this way, we're very pleased to collaborate often with the Social Enterprise Program, which we see as very much an ethical venture. What we find is that by supporting activities which draw out students and also the faculty is the best way to actually reinforce ethical principles. We do this by putting on events on research for practitioners. We had events on womenomics. We had events on the financial crisis and ethics, recently on stereotypes and leadership. And also we'll be having one in a few weeks on quantitative models and their ethical implications. We support innovative programs such as Dialogue for Muslim and Jewish Social Entrepreneurs, which was held during this past summer. And we do research on such things as gender in boards, financial tools to optimize socially responsible portfolios, executive compensation, and financial literacy in the U.S. and abroad. So obviously, Intel was quite fortunate to have Dr. Barrett as a CEO, and I know this from the interviews I've read. He's known for his proverbial humility, but he was also quite fortunate that Intel was able to have him as well. I would think the Thunderbird feels very much the same way. They're quite lucky in this sense, but their gain is also ours. For it's a tremendous contribution, and I really wish to underline this, when we have corporate leaders stand up and say that ethics is something which is necessary for any principled organization in corporate life in the U.S. and elsewhere. With this, I want to introduce to you Dr. Barrett on behalf of Columbia Business School and the Botwinick family, and to say thank you very much for your contributions and to give you the Botwinick Prize for Ethics and in the practice of ethics. Thanks very much. So this is a prisoner for you. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here to represent my former employer, Intel Corporation, and my competitor employer, Thunderbird, although they're not paying me anything. So I wanted to first express my appreciation for the Botwinick Prize and this award and the whole issue of formatting the discussion of ethics. It couldn't happen at a more interesting time in the history of the United States if you look at the newspapers on a daily basis and look at the meltdown of the financial industry, the meltdown of the automotive industry, the financial crisis, recession that we have. Unfortunately, businesses and CEOs have risen to about the same height of public acceptance as most elected politicians, which is at the bottom of the barrel. I find that interesting because as I look about the industry that I'm most familiar with, and that is the high-tech industry, and I would include companies such as Hewlett-Packard and IBM and Cisco and Intel and Microsoft and Texas Instruments and many others in that category, I see a very, very different attitude amongst the executives of those companies and the attitudes of those corporations and how they interface with the world. And what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about that today and then leave some time at the end to try to answer some questions. When I joined Intel in 1974, as mentioned, Intel was founded by two PhDs, one in physical chemistry, one in physics, Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce, and run by a bunch of PhDs, and I have a PhD in material science. At the start of the company, engineers always tend to think that there's a formula that you can apply to just about anything. And the company applied a formula basically to its business code of conduct, or the business ethics the company suggested that its employees follow. When I joined in 1974, the code of conduct book was about 400 pages long and expanding about at the same speed as the IRS tax code. Engineers always feel that you have to define every experiment or every situation that you might find yourself in and then give the precise way that you should behave. But being good engineers, they also realized at that point in time, shortly thereafter, that in fact you could not continue to manage the company that way and not continue to have the principles of operation of the company contained in a book that was getting thicker and thicker each year. That had to be a simpler way. So in the mid to late 70s, we refined our code of conduct to really 2 sentences. And we threw away the 400 or so pages we had at that time. We replaced it by a small form factor, 10-page little book which said, these are the operating principles, this is the business ethics, this is the code of conduct of the company. And you could boil that down. It said in 2 sentences, do the right thing the right way. If you have any questions about how to do the right thing the right way, ask your manager. And that was, in fact, the business code of conduct for the company and still is today. Now, it wasn't totally that simple because you had to have a few other principles that went along with it. One was the mission statement of the company. The mission statement said very simply, do a good job for the 3 constituencies that we're most involved with, our customers, our shareholders, and our employees. And if you looked at each one of those individually, you could refine it very simply that do a good job for your shareholders is obviously to give them a return on their investment. They're the owners of the company. So you should have a solid business model, be successful, give your shareholders a return. For our customers, the one thing that our industry has done for customers is to follow something called Moore's Law. Just a quick show of hands. How many could define Moore's Law for me? Moore's Law says very simply that you get double the capability of an electronic circuit every 18 months or so. Gordon Moore first formulated that observation. It wasn't a law when he formulated it, but in 1965, we're now 44 years beyond 1965. Gordon thought that Moore's Law would last maybe 10 years. It's now going on 50 plus years. We can see that it will go on for another 15 years or so. And so what we do for our customers is we continue to follow Moore's Law as the roadmap of our industry. We give them twice the processing power, twice the memory density, twice the electronic functionality in our new circuits every year or two at the same or less cost than the previous model. So it's an anti-inflationary model, anti-inflationary industry, and doing a good job for our customers is basically to continue to follow Moore's Law, continue to invest heavily in research and development, and continue to bring out great new products that allow you to do things like compute, cell phones, any of the electronic things that you do today. And doing a good thing for our employees is straightforward, and it's what you would expect a major corporation to do. That is, to practice meritocracy, promote on the basis of capability, give all of your employees opportunity for advanced training and professional development. So that was one of the supporting principles behind do the right thing the right way. The second was to, in fact, be a valued member of the communities in which you operate. And this is now an outward-looking principle in addition to the customers, shareholders, and employees. And the way you do that, obviously, is you are a leader in environmental issues, you're a leader in conserving resources, you're a leader in safety. Just a very simple example of that, we have a major manufacturing plant in San Jose, Costa Rica. We take the same environmental rules and regulations and safety concerns to every country that we operate. And basically what we do is we take the most stringent conditions of any country in which we operate and apply that to all countries. And usually the United States is amongst the most stringent. So we exported our safety and environmental issues to Costa Rica, had to retrain the entire construction industry to build the plant, and now have really modified all of the construction safety laws in Costa Rica as an example of what we've done. But that's really outward looking, exporting our inward experience to the communities that we operate. You do that in other ways as well. We're very heavily involved in education. The company spends or contributes about $100 million a year to everything from K through 12 education to university research to promoting educational opportunity for young people around the world. Again, trying to look outward into the community and be a valued member from our actions. A third area, which will give you a most recent example of what we've done, we just celebrated our 40th anniversary or 40th birthday this last year. And we considered how to celebrate that as a milestone event for the corporation, and finally decided that the appropriate way to celebrate the 40th birthday of the company was, in fact, to contribute 1 million hours of volunteer work to the local communities in which we operate. And we slightly exceeded that. I think we had about 1.2 million employee volunteer hours given back to the community. But again, not throwing a major party and a big bash for the company, but in fact trying to give something back to the local community and volunteerism for environmental conservation, education, the good things that employees can do as they go out into the community to work. There are two other principles then beyond the mission statement and beyond being a valued member of the community that the company incorporated. And one was the simple 3M rule that probably many of you are familiar with. And the 3M rule states very simply, when you're doing the right thing the right way, please always keep the 3 M's in mind and don't embarrass any of them. The 3 M's are your mother, your manager, and if you do something, feel comfortable if it is reported in the media exactly the way you've done it. And we try to inform all of our employees, educate them in this, and say, fine, this is our code of conduct, do the right thing the right way, but don't do anything that would embarrass you or your family or the company if it were to be made public. And I think that that has served us very well as we've gone forward. The last thing that we try to preach in the company, which is to emphasize the importance of these principles, is in fact that they should start from the top down, and that the CEO should be just as liable to go out and volunteer time in the community as the lowest paid employee. And so we try to run a company with no perks, and if you go to an Intel facility, you'll find that there are no offices. Everybody has a cubicle. You'll find that there are no reserved parking places. You'll find that there's no executive washroom or executive cafeteria. Everybody stands in line in the same cafeteria or to get into the restroom. The issue of no perks started under Bob Noyce, one of the founders of the company, in the early 70s when our company was expanding very rapidly, and he was confronted with the cost of constructing hard-wall offices, and every time we had a reorganization, you had to re-lay out the building and put new offices in. He finally said, there's probably a better way to do this, and why don't we just go to cubicles? And as soon as Bob did that, he was besieged by a line of people outside of his office at that time, which he still had, and complaining that they were software engineers and that they could not work in the open, that they had to have a private office. And Bob would point out the door to where his cubicle was being constructed and say, if the CEO of the corporation can work in this cubicle, you as a software engineer can work in this cubicle, as they all do today. But that carried over not only to everybody's in a basically the same size cubicle, but that there are no perks in the company. Everybody flies economy class, et cetera. Effectively, the only corporate jets we have are commuter jets, which run all of our employees back and forth amongst our sites in the western part of the U.S. So, no perks, the 3M rule, be a valued member of the community, and do the right things in the right way. Those are what I think have led to the culture of our company, and not just our company. If you look at the other companies that I mentioned, the other high-tech giants, I think they behave in exactly the same way. Now, this has led to us doing, I think, a lot of very positive things. We're usually recognized as a leader in terms of conservation, environmental issues, and any sustainability index, we're usually ranked number 1 or number 2. All the socially oriented funds usually have us on their investment list. So a lot of positive responses have come out of these very simple principles that we try to govern ourselves by. There are a few interesting examples, though, that I'd like to give you, and I'll give you 3 examples of things that have happened in the company over the last 20 years or so, which I think are indicative also of these principles by which we operate. One of them was associated in 1993 with the introduction of the Pentium Microprocessor. And a few years before that, we had started a branding campaign, which I hope a few of you have seen. How many of you have ever seen an Intel Inside brand sticker? Okay, everybody who's awake in the room raise their hand. In 1993, we introduced something called the Pentium Microprocessor, and it was a 32-bit microprocessor, and it had one embarrassing characteristic, that because of a coding error in its memory lookup tables, it refused to multiply and divide a few numbers correctly. And the error associated with this incorrect floating point operation, well, the errors created were usually one digit in about the 8th decimal point. So, from a practical standpoint, they were absolute rounding errors. And the engineers who ran the company at the time said, hey, look, we're going to fix this, but it's really not a big deal. And there was a lot of press in there, and anytime you have something that makes a compute error, it's easy to amplify that compute error by a simple algorithm, and the press was having great fun at our expense associated with this. And the company said, okay, maybe we are stonewalling this. Maybe what we really ought to do is go back and look at our business principles. And our business principles would do the right thing the right way, and the right thing would be to sell people microprocessors that compute accurately. And so we almost immediately took a $500 million charge and replaced all of the million or so processors of which we had sold up to that point in time. Not only because it was the right thing to do, but because we had started the Intel Inside branding campaign 2 years or so before that had brand equity and brand value, and the only way to stand behind that brand value was to do the right thing the right way with regard to your customers. And we did exactly that and stand behind it. It was a great learning experience for the company, but I think it sunk in to the employee base at the time that this is how you should behave when you're dealing with the public and public trust. The second area I think of interest is kind of relates to my predecessor, Andy Grove, who had a famous saying of only the paranoid survive, and especially in the high-tech industry, only the paranoid survive. And what he was really trying to say is Moore's Law is going to move forward whether you pay attention to it or not. And those companies, those individuals who pay attention to Moore's Law and stay at the leadership end of Moore's Law by bringing out new technology and new products will be successful. Those that do not will fall behind. And you should always worry about the people behind you catching up and passing you. There was a recession previous to this one, which is known as the dot-com bubble collapse, latter part of 2000. And that's when the valuation of most of the high-tech companies was considerably decreased. Intel went from about a $400 to $500 billion valuation to about a $100 billion valuation associated with that drop. So 75% or so drop of the valuation of most of the high-tech companies. Business fell off a cliff, and there was really a very disastrous time. And companies were in danger of losing money. Companies like Microsoft and Intel and others that had been high flyers up to that time. But if you looked at Andy Grove's comment, "Only the paranoid survive," you look at another comment that Gordon Moore had made, which was, because our industry moves so fast and because it is so dependent on new products, Gordon had postulated that you can never save your way out of a recession. You can only invest your way out of a recession. And what we did in 2000 and then 2001, 2002, 2003 was not to decrease our investment rate, even though business was terrible, but in fact increased our investment in R&D and increased our investment in new manufacturing capacity and manufacturing capital. This was an interesting time because if you were to read anything about Intel in the press, or you were to go to any of the financial analysts who followed our industry, they all said exactly the same thing, which is, you guys are crazy. Don't you know there is a recession? Don't you know that what they teach you to do in the high-quality business schools of the world during a recession is to cut costs and to lay off people and to downsize and to structure your company for the new situation? And our attitude was somewhat different to that. We said, hey, we think we know our industry better than you outsiders, especially, and this is not a knock at new business school graduates, but new business school graduates who have not been through a recession or two, and I've been through 10 in my career at Intel, don't quite know what to think when a recession hits you and how to behave, and it's very easy to think the classic thoughts of downsize, lay off people, you'll get rewarded by Wall Street by having to lay off, etc. We chose exactly the opposite, which was to increase our investment during that period of time. For 3 years, we had nothing but negative comments written about us in the press and financial community. There was one day in 1994, for about a microsecond, when demand reoccurred, someone wrote, oh, those guys at Intel were probably right for the last 3 years, but then the next day they found something new to criticize us about. But the point was that doing the right thing the right way was, in fact, recognizing the nature of your industry, recognizing the need to continue to follow Moore's Law, recognizing the need to continue to invest in new technology and new products to do a good job for your shareholders, your customers, and your employees. And so we basically went back to our basic principles of how to run the company and acted in that fashion and didn't listen to the outside advice we were getting. The last example that I want to give you is an example of, I always use the English incorrect phrase of doing good by doing good as opposed to doing well by doing good. But the World Ahead program that we have run in as the part of our $100 million really philanthropic program to support education around the world is a program that runs in over 60 countries with over 200 programs. And the bulk of that program is really introducing education systems around the world, including the system here in the United States, to how to use technology to enhance education, how to use technology to make education more interesting, more exciting for young children, and fundamentally how to give every child around the world the equal opportunity for educational attainment and equal opportunity for their professional career going forward. The basics of this program is very simple. We train roughly 1 million teachers a year. We've trained somewhere between 6 and 7 million teachers around the world now on how to integrate technology into the curriculum. Not how to use computers, but how do you effectively use technology to enhance the learning experience. That program, I think, is exceptionally effective. It's worked around the world. We've trained over 1 million teachers in China, 1 million teachers here in India. It's one of my substantial disappointments that we've only been able to train about 250,000 teachers in the United States, because the educational institution in the United States is very resistant to outside influence on it to change the way it does business. The rest of the world is very excited about educational opportunity, education development, and the quality of the education system they run. We mostly talk about it in the United States at the K through 12 level rather than doing anything about it. But again, that is a program of doing well by doing good. What we're doing is, in fact, enhancing young people's lives, enhancing the capability of teachers and education systems around the world. But in fact, it also obviously grows business for us in the future. So it's a long-term investment for our future as a company, as well as it is an investment for those young people around the world. So those 3 examples, I think, are symptomatic of how we behave consistent with the principles by which we run the company. I wanted to make just a few forward-looking comments before we get to the questions and answers in terms of what I think some of the challenges in terms of business ethics are going to be going forward. And I don't have to go very far from the daily newspaper to address these. There's a healthcare debate going on in Washington, D.C. And if you're trained as an engineer, one of the things you're always trained on is, before you try to solve any problem, get a clear definition of what the problem is and get consensus amongst the people who are working on it of what problem you're trying to solve. At the highest level in Washington, the statement is, we are going to save healthcare. We're going to reform healthcare. My definition of the problem is that if you're going to reform healthcare, then you need to figure out how to get better healthcare at lower cost. The Washington, D.C. exercise today is, in fact, one of how do you insure more people and how do you spend more money without changing the system. And if you read any of the proposals, either the House proposal or the proposal about to come from Senator Baucus's Finance Committee, you'll find that they are both, how do we insure more people and spend more money without reforming the system? The challenge, I think, here for the private sector, the health care sector, in interfacing with the government in this topic is someone has to stand up on principle and say, are we solving a problem or are we just spending more money? And these are the sort of issues I think you'll be faced with as you get out in the professional world. The increasing role of governments around the world in promoting rules, regulations, and laws to interact with the business community will put a burden on CEOs and companies to respond to these rules and regulations in, I think, an appropriate fashion. That is to be very straightforward and come out with, hey, this is the issue you're trying to solve. You're not solving it by this. All you're doing is passing the burden of debt of your actions on to the future generations, and you're not solving the problem. There are many other instances like this. Those of you who might have looked at the Wall Street Journal op-ed page yesterday, there was an op-ed in there by Mukhtar Kent, the CEO of Coca-Cola. And what he was saying was very simple. There's an obesity problem in the United States, and Washington's solution to the obesity problem is to tax all sugar-based soft drinks. And Mr. Kent was basically saying in his op-ed piece, now wait a minute, sugar could be part of the problem, but that's only a small part of the problem. The problem is really not just the intake, but it's also the outflow. Americans have become very sedentary. They don't exercise nearly as much as they used to. They eat more than they used to. Actually, Coke is a small fraction of their caloric input. If you really want to solve this problem, let's define the problem appropriately and then have a solution that fits the definition of the problem, not a simplistic solution that just says tax Coca-Cola. Again, this is an area where CEOs and companies have to speak in a forthright fashion about the rules and regulations and laws that governments, which are increasingly involved in the business community, are trying to promote. And the last area I would point out is actually one that my own company is involved with right now, and that is with regulators around the world who are, in fact, regulators who have the role of accusing, judging, and fining companies on their actions. And I'm speaking specifically here about the Competition Commission in the European Union, which recently fined our company about $1 billion, citing the fact that we are a large company have the potential power to misbehave, and also the commissioner of the Competition Commission, Nellie Kroes, has stated that it's her job in life to make sure that no company has more than 50% market share in any business around the world. When you look at the fact that you are, as a CEO, trying to bring value to the consumer, when you look at the fact that the Department of Labor has studied, I think, continually compiles statistics on 1,200 consumer-related items, and microprocessors are deemed the most anti-inflationary, the most competitive of all the line items that the Department of Labor in the United States tracks. And then you have a foreign entity who says, we don't like the way you're doing business, then I think that's also a time when CEOs and companies have to speak out in a forthright fashion about their ethics, about the way that they do business, and defend their right to do business in that fashion. So let me just conclude by looking forward. I think the challenge is increasingly going to be for CEOs and companies and business executives really to stand behind the ethics that they have and that they manage their companies by in the face of governments who do not always have the same ethical background and certainly don't always have the same breadth of view of what goes on in companies and in industries around the world. But again, let me express my appreciation to Columbia, the Botwinick family, for supporting this dialogue on business ethics. I think it is now a good time to perhaps go into a question and answer session. I think we have a couple of microphones, so thank you for your attention so far. There's two microphones there, one on each side. Yes, sir.
Hi. I was wondering, in the spirit that you've taken us through a couple of examples of how you've dealt or how Intel has dealt with cases using the principles you talked about, if you could continue to take us forward and deal with some government versus corporations, like you were just describing, where perhaps the government people are negotiating with you. So, for example, I know Microsoft, for example, is negotiating with the European antitrust people on their, which browser include in the new version of Windows, and it sounds like they've worked out an agreement. So how do you see other cases like that, in other words, where you have to negotiate with the government people?
Well, the main objection I have with the European Union, first of all, it's important for everyone in the audience to know that the EU and the US have two pretty drastically different policies on antitrust. The US policy is basically to protect the consumer. The European policy is to protect the competitor. And so the EU only really acts on competitor complaint. They don't react on consumer complaint or damaging consumers. When the commissioner basically dictates that it's, in her opinion, that no company should have over 50% market share regardless of how good a job they're doing, but just as a matter of principle, I would find objection to that, and I wouldn't negotiate that issue away. I'd say, look, if we are investing better, bringing better products into the marketplace, doing a better job for the consumer, how can you object that we make money at the same time as doing that, and we're doing a good job servicing the consumer? So in that instance, the only negotiation that you can basically have is, Intel, would you step back and give your competitor 50% market share? I don't think that that's an ethical position that I have to abide by or stand behind. Let me get out of the EU for a minute and let us come to the United States with some real current examples of policy that's about to come out of Washington. One is to harmonize the U.S. tax policy to all foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies. The U.S. currently has the second highest corporate tax rate in the world, behind Japan by 0.1%. And companies like Intel and every other high-tech company operate in many foreign environments where local tax rates are substantially different. Ireland, the corporate tax rate is 12%. In places like China and Malaysia, the corporate tax rate can be 0, or you can have a tax holiday for a certain period of time. The U.S. policy here is to nominally to keep jobs from going offshore to a lower tax environment. An alternative opinion of that is, in fact, that unless you have the ability to be competitive and operate in those environments, you can't be competitive on a worldwide basis. So if you harmonize the U.S. tax rate to all foreign countries, what you'll do is penalize U.S. companies against foreign companies. We speak out very loudly in that issue against the U.S. administration with its current proposals. But I mean, these are perhaps two examples, real time, which are going on today. Yes?
Hi, I'm Robert Stevenson from Blastbeat in Ireland. We run a global organization that teaches social entrepreneurship to high school students. Delighted that you're here, thank you very much. And also great to see what Intel are investing in education, which is, I think, key to the future of any economy. I'd just like to ask a question is, do you think that corporations could do more to teach social entrepreneurship to high school students who are the future? Because, and Intel is a great example of investment in education, but do you feel that there could be a lot more public-private investment in social entrepreneurship in schools?
The answer has to be yes. Industry could do a lot more in public-private partnerships, promoting all aspects of education. Our education endeavors have been primarily associated with mathematics and science education because of the background of the company and the importance of that to the company. But we have in our teacher training programs around the world where we demonstrate how to integrate technology into the classroom, that's done from the standpoint of all education, whether it's language education, history, arts, math, science, literature, what have you. In addition to that, we also are engaged in programs with a number of U.S. and foreign universities in entrepreneurship, taking work out of the Haas Business School at UC Berkeley and translating that to a number of universities around the world and teaching entrepreneurship. And at the much lower level, we're involved with Muhammad Yunus and one of the spin-outs of really the Grameen work that he got the Nobel Prize for in terms of providing technology for the next level up of the Bangladesh phone ladies, if you think of that as the model by which he got his Nobel Prize, but how to get beyond just phones, but to make information accessible to remote villages to promote entrepreneurship. So there's a huge opportunity here from a business sector and a huge opportunity to have public-private partnerships in that area. Yes?
Hi, Lisa Buxbaum from Soaring Words. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. It was very inspiring. My question to you is a personal one. What's the professional accomplishment that you're most proud of and why? and also the personal accomplishment that you're most proud of and why.
Oh, personal accomplishment was marrying my wife, who's here today. I think the professional accomplishment had to be looking at our industry in the mid-1980s when, if I can use a non-elegant term here in this group, we were getting our butt kicked by Japanese corporations at that point in time. And most of the learned people in the United States and financial community suggested that the future was dim for the U.S. semiconductor industry. The Japanese were going to produce all semiconductors in the future. We might be able to design some, but we should never think about manufacturing them. We took plane load after plane load of our people to Japan and studied their manufacturing techniques. Decided that they weren't doing anything secret, they weren't doing anything special, that we could do the same thing and we could probably do it better. So in the early 1980s, after having gone to Japan on many trips to see what the competition was doing, the best professional moment of my life was in the 1990s when the Japanese executives started to come to Intel to see what we were doing. And that's when we became the largest semiconductor company in the world, and I think became recognized as the best semiconductor manufacturer with the best technology in the world, and still hold that position today. So being the largest and most successful company in our industry for nearly 2 decades, I think there's a certain amount of professional pride that goes with that. And we did turn that around in the mid-'80s. Yes?
Hi, my name is Andy Thornton. I'm a software engineer, so I've benefited heavily from the work of Intel. But my question's about ethics. I think there's a lot of people in the US at the moment who feel that the gap between base salaries and CEO salaries has grown to an excessive level, particularly compared to, say, the 60s. And given that at Intel you have a policy of the CEO sits in a cubicle as well, have you found that the classical argument where people say, well, you have to pay what the market demands, has that stopped Intel hiring at the highest level? And I was wondering if you'd like to share the multiplier, if you know it, between the lowest salary and the highest salary in the company.
I don't know it today. And it would really depend on how you looked at it. Obviously, if you looked at it just from a salary standpoint or a salary plus bonus standpoint, you'd get one number. If you looked at it with the equity compensation, you'd get a totally different number. In the company, we tried to put most of the executive compensation at, call it risk compensation, which is associated with the performance of the company and long-term performance of the company with long-term stock options. So we have tried to drive behavior driven off of that as opposed to any short-term financial success of the company. The other point I'd put out is that we are increasingly what I would call a very highly educated company, where you need a 2-year AA degree to even to get in the door for an entry-level manufacturing position, and the bulk of the engineers we hire today are master's degrees and PhDs, so that tends to skew the entry-level compensation up as well. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mike Diamond. I'm a MBA student from NYU. High-tech companies have had, though competitors, have had lots of success working collaboratively together, be it with standards on motherboards, USB, in addition, working together affecting government policy. My question to you is if there's any guidance or best practices that you could offer on how some of those successes can translate over to nonprofits for advocacy and defining standards.
Oh, golly. The fundamental tenet of the personal computer industry, which we are deeply involved in, is it is built on standards. And as a PC looks like a PC, whether you're in Beijing or Boston or Bangalore. And so either market standards or community standards are very critical to maintain that interoperability between our devices. And sometimes it's a market standard. The IBM PC set the market standard many years ago, and Intel and Microsoft were both part of that, and subsequently the x86 architecture and Windows became, or I guess I should say Windows became the accepted standards. But the industry sets its standards for mutual benefit, and I'm not that familiar with the nonprofits and all their activities, but certainly there's the same opportunity for mutual benefit by having common standards of delivery. For example, NetHope is a common standard of communication infrastructure for nonprofits, which we've been involved with in helping them create communication standards and PC standards for first responders to natural disasters. Having that kind of standard infrastructure, I think, is a very valuable tool for nonprofits to aid their response and lower their individual investment to achieve that capability. Okay. Last question.
So, as probably the only Thunderbird in the room, I'm happy to have the last question. My question gets back to, you drove global standards through Intel. And as a consultant living in China, working on social as well as for-profit, one of the things I find is you're probably one of the few companies that does that. Local plus standardization is pretty common. Can you talk a little bit about the leadership that you can share with others in your industry or outside in the greater, American infrastructure, American, ethical community in developing global standards on manufacturing within the environmental sector?
Okay. I want to make sure that I answer the last question correctly. So you're interested in comments on global standards?
So creating global standards on a wider basis. Right now, it's still pretty fragmented.
To a certain degree, global standards tend to get set by the purchasing community, the consumer, as opposed to what governments try to do. And we could talk about the Chinese government here for a moment. We could talk about the Japanese government back in the 80s, and the Chinese are doing quite similar to the Japanese playbook today, which is to try to, in effect, protect their own marketplace by having local standards as opposed to opening their marketplace to global standards. As I said, the PC industry is developed by global standards, such as the PC is the same everywhere around the world. In the communications area, we end up getting a couple of different standards which are somewhat competing, but not that dissimilar, but somewhat competing, again, set up by geographic or country differences. In the 80s, early 90s, the Japanese tried to create their own computing standards to counter the global standard of the personal computer. The reason they did that is they wanted to have preference for Japanese companies with their own standard, protect their own marketplace. The Chinese have had a few aborted attempts to do the same thing, but have been not successful, basically because of the international marketplace today and the need for people to travel, information to travel, computing to travel, and to have a standard of computing platform around the world. It's very difficult for any one country to establish its own standard in competition with the rest of the world. It ends up putting your business people at a disadvantage, even though it might locally protect your marketplace. So the issue of global standards, I think, is generally set by adoption of the purchasing community, the consumer, and then governments try to counter that sometime from a protectionist standpoint, but it gets to be very difficult once the standard is established. I don't know if that was in the direction of your question or not. If not, fire again.
Well, it was also in terms of just leadership. When you're talking about ethics and leadership within companies, if you're developing a global ethical platform for Intel and the way that you operate, the way that you invest, the way that you build a company, other companies are not doing the same. They have the American standard is the highest, so they meet laws here, but then they drive right down to the Chinese law and just say, oh, okay, we're meeting the minimum standard.
Yeah. Well, comment I made earlier, and I think it's a very good practice, is what we established in the environmental area very early in our company was we have only one environmental standard. That was the toughest of anywhere we operated. And we've tried to take that same principle in education and everything else we do, whether it's labor laws, education, professional development, environment, safety. We try to operate by one uniform standard. Just as an example, in China, after the Sichuan earthquake in May of 2008, I guess, I happened to be there in June of 2008, where we donated the first of 200 computer classrooms to destroyed schools in Sichuan province. Responding to a natural disaster in China like we would respond to a natural disaster here in the United States, providing that capability. But that's exactly the same sort of activity we had with Katrina in Louisiana and Mississippi. Because we operate in China, we respond to the Chinese community exactly the same way we'd go to the U.S. So my response to a companion CEO or corporate officer would be, you're better off with one standard and pick the highest standard possible and then translate that standard to all the environments that you operate in.
Thank you very much. We have one last comment from Mr. Botwinick.
Excuse me, Craig, on behalf of the Botwinick and Wolfenson families and the Botwinick-Wolfenson Foundation, I want to congratulate you. As you know, I've had a long knowledge and relationship with Intel, and I consider Intel to be truly a national treasure. And for those of you who are cynics, with all of the social responsibility and ethical responsibility that the company has shown, they are also immensely profitable and consistently profitable. And I congratulate you, and I'm really pleased to have finally met you.
It's our pleasure.